What's going on, guys? Alex here, and today I'm answering your tax questions from Reddit. Now, this question comes from Spicy Korean Noodles, and this person asks the following. This is a CA tax question, writing off rent as a business expense. So we're going to talk about this in terms of California, but we'll also talk about the federal rules that pertain to the deduction of rent as a business expense, and then we'll tie it back to California. But the question goes as follows. I used to have a boss who rented a studio for about $1,900 plus $250 in parking expenses and utilities. And she got the office because you can write off the whole place as a business expense. She did operate from there. That's what the boss said. So I guess the questions are as follows. Can you write off all of the studio if you work from there, the rent aspect? Then can you write off the parking, and can you write off utilities? So let's talk about the home office deduction. All right, so the home office deduction is really meant for taxpayers who work from home. And if you have a separate office location that you work from the vast majority of the time and you just do a few things at home, that may not qualify for you for the home office deduction. Now, there are three requirements to be able to write off home office expenses for business purposes. Now, the first one is that it's your principal place of business, which means that you don't have 5 other offices that you have access to, that you work from predominantly most of the time. Your home office needs to be your principal place of business. That's where you transact most of your business from. Pretty simple. Now, on top of that, it also has to be used regularly. So if you use your home office just once or twice per year, that may not cover it, okay? It has to be used on a regular basis for business purposes. So that's the second requirement. The third requirement is the exclusivity requirement. This is where a lot of taxpayers get tripped up. Quite simply, it has to be an area of the home or a room or portion of a room that's used exclusively for business purposes. So I'm not sure if families have that family computer in the den or something like that everybody uses, but that wouldn't qualify because there are other family members using that computer when it's not being used for business purposes. There was actually a tax court case where home office expenses were disallowed because kids' toys were found where the home office location was supposed to be. That's how strict this gets. So you want to make sure that it's exclusively for business use. So if you have a location in your home that you use it for business, but once business hours are over, you use the same location for just general leisure, browsing the web, sending emails, that's not going to qualify either. Exclusive means exclusive in this regard. So those are the three requirements. It needs to be your principal place of business, meaning that if you have another location that you use the majority of the time for business purposes, that may restrict you from using the home office deduction. So principal place of business, regular use, once or twice or sporadic use may not get you there, and has to be exclusive. Okay, so those are the three requirements. And the important aspect to take into account when you're looking at the home office deduction is the fact that you don't just get to deduct everything, okay? Rarely in the tax code do you just get to throw everything on the tax return as a deduction. What am I talking about? In looking at the fact pattern, it looks like this person rented a studio for $1,900 plus $250 in parking expenses plus utilities. And the boss said that she got the studio because you could write off the whole place as a business expense because she did operate from there. Incorrect. That's wrong, all right? And here's how the home office deduction generally works. Pull out a handy-dandy spreadsheet. I love these things. So let's say this is your primary residence. Let's make it a little bigger. Let's be generous. All right. So we have here the primary residence. And let's say you use a portion of it, let's say 10%. Not exactly 10%, but close enough. A portion of it for business purposes, this green area. All right. So if this green area is 10% of the total square footage of your residence, and that is exclusively used for business, that is your principal place of business, and you use it regularly for business purposes, then you may be able to claim the home office deduction. But it's not going to be the entire rent, because let's just say the home office percentage. So let's just take a look at how this square footage calculation works out. So the total square footage residence. Okay, so let's make this pretty. All right, so let's say it's 1,000 square feet. All right. Now, let's also assume that the total square footage used exclusively for business purposes, meeting those 3 requirements that I talked about, make sure you guys can see this, is 100 square feet. Okay, it could be a room, could be a portion of a room, but it has to meet those requirements. So the way we make the allocation, quite simply, is as follows. All right, we simply divide the square footage used exclusively for business by the total square footage of the residence, and we get 10%. So the question is, what does that 10% really mean? That 10% determines how much of the applicable expenses you can deduct related to that exclusive use of the home for business purposes. So, for example, let's look at some of the expenses. All right, so typically you may be looking at rent. You may be looking at renter's insurance. Maybe looking at also utilities. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so that covers some of them. We'll get to parking in a second, but let's say the rent is $10,000 a year. Let's say the homeowner's insurance is $250, utilities another $3,000. Okay, so the total expenses for the property are as follows. But remember, we have to make an allocation for the home office use. So we will do that as follows. All right. And quite simply, we take 10% of each of those. And that's how we calculate the home office deduction, essentially. So you can see that it's 10% of this $10,000, it's 10% of this renter's insurance is $250, and the utilities works the same way. That's why it's important to make sure that you figure out what portion of the residence you're actually using for business purposes, right? So we got this green area here. You have to make that calculation. So what the boss missed in terms of taking the home office deduction with the studio is thinking that this person was clever and that they're saying, hey, it's a studio, so how am I supposed to separate it? I can't separate it out. Well, you look at the square footage. That's how that's done. So if a third of that studio was used exclusively for business purposes, then a third of the expenses, or 33.33%, would be allocable for business, not the entire property, because this person had to sleep somewhere, they had to cook somewhere, and all of those aspects are personal use, right? So we'd be violating exclusivity by doing those personal activities in the portion of the residence, which in this case is 100% being deducted, apparently. And it's not going to work that way. So you have to be careful. The first step you have to take is to get the total square footage of the residence. That's where you start. All right. Then you take the total square footage exclusively used for business purposes. Then you do some division. You get the business use percentage, and that is the main driver for the expense allocation. That's how that works. All right. So this boss is incorrect in how they approach this. And they deducted much more than they should have because they misinterpreted the rules in this regard. And in this case, the fact that there could have been a third or a quarter or even 10% of the property that was used for business purposes, they took the entire deduction. So their deduction was way overblown. It's a problem. But there is a tax court case that's very interesting about this area, and it's Miller v. Commissioner. So if you want to look this up, you can Google Miller v. Commissioner tax court case. I'm going to throw a link in the description in the chat here for you guys. All right. So this case is involving a taxpayer who had a home office in good old Manhattan. And let's just take a look here. The home office, the total living space was 700 square feet. So this was a very small apartment, right? New York doesn't have huge apartments in many cases if you're not paying that much in rent. So 700 square feet was the square footage of the residence. And the argument that this taxpayer made was, hey, you know, I need to go through the personal areas of my small apartment to get to the exclusive business use areas, or even the other way around, meaning I had to go through the exclusive business use areas to get to the personal use areas of my apartment. That's how small it was. So, for example, if we look at our little diagram here, so let's say the exclusive home office use was here, the door was here, and they needed to go through the door past the exclusive home office use area to get to the rest of their residence. So their argument here was, hey, you know, I can't avoid that area in terms of getting in and out of my apartment. So that shouldn't violate the exclusivity parameter, being that there's no other way I can allocate my apartment. So this is a very interesting case. If you really want to understand home office deductions and how they work, read Miller v. Commissioner. It's very understandable. It's in plain English, and it gets into the nitty-gritty details of how the home office deduction is calculated. Now, the IRS, they didn't like the fact that this person was going through this exclusive use area into the rest of the residence. They said, hey, it's not exclusive for business use if you're going in and out of the residence for personal purposes. The tax court disagreed. They said, hey, you know, if you have a small enough residence and you go through the exclusive business use area to get in and out of the apartment, there's no way to avoid it. It's okay. You could take the deduction. All right. So it's an interesting case in that it worked out in the taxpayer's favor, but it just highlights the importance of that exclusive business use parameter, because the IRS does not like when there's abuse in this area. Now, there also, so this case might be what the boss was relying on to try to substantiate her position, but she totally misinterpreted it, okay? And you don't want to be in a position where you deducted that much more in office expenses than you should have. It's going to cause problems, I can tell you. So Miller v. Commissioner, great case. Now, I have some clients that say, hey, Alex, this is a lot of math. All right, I want something simpler. Luckily, for those individuals, there is a simplified home office deduction, which will allow you to avoid having to deal with all these calculations and trying to figure out the percentages and all those different expense line items. Sometimes it's a pain. I understand. And what you can do is refer to good old IRS publication 587. Let me just make sure that that is the case. Yeah, 587, business use of your home. And you can see here that, let's take a look. If you click on using the simplified method over here, this provides some detail into this simplified method. Now, how does it work? Let me make sure you guys can see this. So this is the simplified home office deduction. The simplified method is an alternative to the calculation, allocation, and substantiation of actual expenses. In most cases, you will figure your deduction by multiplying $5, the prescribed rate, by the area of your home used for qualified business use. The area used to figure a deduction is limited to 300 square feet. All right, so let's go back to our example. What does all that mean? So here, whereas to calculate the actual home office expenses, let's label this. We have to go through all of this math, right? The simplified home office deduction works as follows. All right. The only bit of information we really need is this. The total square footage used exclusively for business. We don't even need to measure the entire residence. So it's 100 square feet. Now, all we need to really make sure is that we're applying the 300 square foot limitation. So as long as this amount is 300 or less, then we're good. Now, the way you calculate the deduction is as follows. We have the prescribed rate, which is the amount of deduction you get per square foot of business use. And we get that from publication 587, $5 right here, by the area exclusively used for business. So quite frankly, simplified home office deduction is 100 square feet times the $5. So in this case, the deduction would be $500. Whereas over here on the actual expense side, we have $13,250. So you can see there's a give and take. There's more work on the actual expenses side. But if you want to skip all of that and say, hey, I just want to keep it nice and simple, you've got the simplified home office deduction where it says just take the square footage exclusively used for business. And again, you got those three requirements. You have principal place of residence, regular use, exclusivity. Then you multiply it by $5. As long as you're calculating based on 300 square feet or less, you get $5 per square foot. It's less of a deduction, but less of a hassle. If you want the higher deduction for home office use, then you need to go through the calculation and figure them on a line-by-line basis. So that is how the home office deduction essentially works. You got those three requirements. If you meet those, then you should be good to go in calculating the deduction. Now, this is if you rent your primary residence. Now, if you purchased it, if you owned your home, then this rent line item would be substituted with mortgage, interest, property taxes, and so forth. But in this case, we're assuming that the taxpayer is renting their primary residence. All right, so going back to the question, we addressed, can you write off all of the rent for a studio if you work from there? Now, everybody watching should know the answer to that. No, you need to allocate whatever percentage of that home office is actually used exclusively for business purposes compared to the total square footage. On the other hand, you can also use the simplified home office deduction, which we took a look at, but certainly the answer to this question is no. You need to allocate it. Can you also write off parking? So parking expenses are related to auto expenses. Now, auto expenses are a whole area in and of themselves, but in this case, I would not include parking expenses as part of the home office deduction. I would include that more as part of the auto expenses, which you need the mileage calculation done and so on and so forth. That's a whole nother video. But quite simply, I would not include the parking expenses in terms of the home office use. I would use the mileage calculation and deduct it as an auto expense. Again, it depends on the circumstances. Sometimes it can go either way, but in general, that's where I would default. And if the details of the situation speak differently, we'll go from there. So, can you write off utilities? Utilities would be written off like I showed here. So you have the expense allocation. Utilities is one of the line items. So in general, you would still take the percentage allocable to the home exclusive use of the home office and calculate it that way. And that would be part of the business use of the home office deduction. So certainly utilities would fall into that category as well. Overall, this is an area where I see a lot of confusion, and taxpayers get tripped up because they have to come up with all of these numbers and do all these calculations. But in some cases, the simplified home office deduction may actually end up being higher than the actual expense deduction. So in that case, you have a choice as to which one you want to take. But this is essentially how the calculation is done. Hopefully that answers the question. If you guys have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out, like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. I love reading your comments. And as always, hopefully this was helpful. Thanks for watching.